In this video, I'm going to walk you through how to create recursive workflows in the backend workflows area of your editor. A recursive workflow is a workflow that runs on a loop, and you're in control of when each run of that loop triggers and for how long. You can have infinite recursive workflows, such as a weekly email that gets scheduled to run every single week on whatever day of the week and time that you want. You can also have finite recursive workflows where you have a specific number of loops depending on what's happening in the actions. And once it has reached that number, it will stop. We'll go over an example in this video for this involving importing new users from a CSV. Recursive workflows are incredibly powerful for automation features, but it's important to understand how to set these up correctly. Otherwise, you may end up with an unintentional infinite loop that could potentially trigger a lot of database changes that you don't want. Now, let's start by understanding the difference between a recursive API workflow and the recurring event trigger that we see here. Recursive API workflows are normal API workflows, right? So you would create a new API workflow here, and I've got an example like this here, that is set up to schedule itself to run again, okay? So this workflow here is called create user. It's gonna run certain actions, and then in the last step, it's gonna schedule itself right here, create user. This is the same workflow to run all over again, thus creating a loop. Again, we're going to go over how to design things like this and also pay attention to the conditional statements so that you can stop the loop when needed. But this is what makes a normal API workflow recursive. It's the fact that it will schedule itself to run again. A workflow can also be considered recursive if it involves multiple API workflows running in a sequence. So if this first workflow were to trigger a second API workflow, that second API workflow triggers a third. And if that third workflow triggers the start of the whole flow, so it triggers the first one from the very beginning, that's also considered recursive because we're just creating a big loop in that case. So as you can imagine, you can create a really complex flow, but we'll keep it simple for this video so that you can see how to leverage this capability. Now, the recurring event trigger, on the other hand, right? So this is a separate trigger here. This is an older type of capability that doesn't offer any benefits above the recursive system. In fact, we actually recommend you stay away from this event and stick with the recursive workflows for any recurring sequences you need. You can do everything and more with the recursive system, okay? Now, of course, I don't want to leave you in the dark about the recurring events, so I'll give you a quick overview of how this would work. If you were to trigger a recurring event, right? So on some page in my application, let's say that I click on this button here, Enable Weekly Reminder, we would go to, let me show you from here, custom events, and then we would say set cancel a recurring event. So you can see how this is a different action to trigger that event. It's different from scheduling an API workflow. Now, you'll see that you get a fixed number of frequencies here, okay? Daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, and yearly. With the recursive system, you can do whatever frequency you want, down to the second. Not only that, but when it comes to these recurring events, the higher the frequency, the higher the paid plan your app needs to be on. So recursive workflows don't actually have that limitation. You can do whatever frequency you want without needing to be on a specific plan. The only requirement, I should say, is in order to work with any backend workflows, doesn't matter whether it's recursive or not, any backend workflows, you do have to be on a paid plan in order to run them. You can set them up if you're on the free plan, but you do have to be on at least the first paid plan to run them. But once you're on that first paid plan, you can run recursive workflows for any frequency you want. Okay, so that's different from the recurring events, which have these fixed frequencies, and your plan actually dictates which ones are available to you. Okay, now recurring events also have a limit on how many things in your database these events are attached to. Whereas recursive workflows don't need to relate to things at all, and there's no limit, even if they are. So like I said, stay away from the recurring event trigger because there's not a lot of control there. You're going to be able to do everything you need with a recursive API workflow system, and that's what we're going to be talking about in the rest of this video. So I'm going to close this. So let's take a look at a simple example for setting up a recursive workflow. I'm going to start by creating a new API workflow. I'm also going to color code this in green. Both of the green endpoints here are going to be used in this video for examples. And this one I'm going to name it Weekly Reminder. Okay, so the idea is I want to set up a looping workflow to run every single week so that when it runs, it will send an email. Of course, I can do other things. I can make changes to my database. I can create records. I can do lots of other things, but we'll stick with just this email action here. I'll fill these out in a moment. Now I'm going to move on to the next step, which is to schedule this same workflow to run again. So I'm going to go back to the custom events list and schedule API workflow. Okay, not on a list, just one single trigger to schedule this same weekly reminder event. And the schedule date will be the current date and time plus 1 week. We'll do plus 7 days here. So this is going to be triggered for the first time from my page, right? Something needs to kick things off, which is what this button is here for. And when this triggers, it will send the email, and then it will schedule itself to run again in 7 days. So 7 days from now, it sends the email again, schedules itself to run again the next week. Okay, so from my page, when I click on this button, I want to trigger kind of the first run of that workflow. So I'll do schedule API workflow. Again, we'll select weekly reminder, and the schedule date can be whenever I want this to begin. And knowing that from that point, it's going to be at the same time every single week, right? Because it's pulling the current date and time. So the first thing I'm going to do is round the current date and time to the beginning of the week that I'm in. So this will knock me back to Sunday of the week that I'm currently in. I want to send my emails out on Monday, so I'm going to add 1 day to this, like this. And I want the first weekly reminder to actually go out next week. If I'm rounding things down to the beginning of the week, it is going to be rounded down to a date in the past, okay? So I've currently converted this to the last Monday, and I'm going to now add 7 days to this so that the first time I trigger it, it's going to happen the next upcoming Monday, right? So a little bit of date manipulation there. Now from here, I also want it to go out at a specific time. So I'm going to change the hour to 8 and also change the minute to 0 and change the second to 0 as well for cleanliness. So I've converted this so that the first time that this runs is the next upcoming Monday at 8 a.m. That way, in the recursive loop, whenever this goes to schedule itself, it's always going to be on a Monday at 8 a.m. Okay, you have a lot of control over these dates and times. And notice how I'm hard coding these values. You know, I'm doing these manipulations here. You could also pull in values that your users are in control of. Maybe they're preferences that you've saved to the database or inputs that are on the page or dates and time pickers. So you can definitely have them control this as well. So once I click on this button, it's going to kick things off by scheduling the first run of this endpoint. The email will run, and then it will schedule itself to run all over again the next week. Now, because there's no condition on this, this is always going to run. It's an infinite loop, right? Every single week, this is going to run here. Now, you can control this loop and actually stop the loop by adding conditions. So let's say, for example, you have a yes or no field on the user record to say, you know, that they do or do not want to receive this weekly reminder. And so you can have a condition that says only run this as long as that yes or no field is set to yes. Right? And if they disable it, they change it to no. And so the next time this tries to run, it's not going to pass and you've stopped the loop. And they would have to re-enable it again, re-kick this off, right? Trigger this for the first time so that it can start over. And they're back in the loop. Okay. You can also add conditions here so that the loop continues to run based on, you know, other values in the database. So, you know, maybe it's a subscriber that has to be active versus being on a canceled plan. So you can check their status, for example. Or maybe it's based on a certain number of things existing in the database or some, you know, actual value in a numerical field in the database. You control what allows this loop to continue. Okay. So in this example, if the user is going to click on this button to enable weekly reminders, we can set up the email, let's say it's going to themselves, to go to the current user's email address. Now the current user works here because Bubble will remember who triggered this API workflow. But just be mindful that if these workflows are triggered from your editor, right, from the data tab in this bulk operation here, there is no user attached to it. That's kind of like a system admin function. So you want to be careful. You don't want to refer to current user in those cases. It will end up with a blank value. But if there is a user who's logged in and they are triggering a backend workflow, Bubble will know who that was, and you can refer to the current user safely there. If you need to refer to other users, then I recommend adding another parameter here for whatever other user needs to be passed in. So the type should be user in this case. Okay. And that way, when whoever triggers this, let's say it's a manager and they want to send weekly reminders to, a staff member or some employee. So this could be a single user, or it can be a list of users, and they would provide those details there. And then you can reference that parameter value instead of the current user here. Okay. So that's a simple example of, a weekly recursive event, but notice how you have complete control over the frequency. I could say, do something every, 30 seconds, for example, or I could have no delay. And what that would do is Bubble would simply trigger the workflow to run again immediately after the previous run. So it's a good way to also control how many runs of a workflow are running at once. Let's say you have a bulk process, and we're actually going to go over an example here in a second, where you need to, process many lists of items, thousands of items. And every item needs to go through some sequence of actions. Well, if you set it up as a recursive workflow, you are helping the performance of that entire process, because Bubble's going to run one flow at a time. It won't trigger itself to run again until the previous flow has completed. Okay, so you only need as much app capacity as it requires to do one flow at a time. And in that way, you can have things run, one right after another without necessarily putting any more delay between runs. But the fact that you can add some spacing there, with whatever frequency you want, gives you much more control to ensure reliability and consistently completed workflows without crashing your application. Okay, be very careful with the timing. Because you could end up with, lots of things happening very quickly, or a lot of records happening very quickly, and also be careful with your conditions so that you don't end up in an infinite loop situation when you didn't mean to have one. Okay, now I'm going to remove this parameter here, and we'll go back to having this set up as +7 days. Now let's look at a slightly more complex workflow involving a recursive system for importing users. Okay, so let's take this example. I have a file uploader that the user can upload a CSV with students. Okay, so here's an example CSV record. Let's say that this is a school administrator or a teacher of some kind that is importing student records and wants to create a user account for each student. Okay, now I've only got 10 rows here, 10 students listed here, but this is something that would be much more beneficial and why you would want to use a recursive system if you had thousands and thousands of rows, or you needed to perform multiple actions for every imported student. A recursive system is great for that because it really helps keep the performance optimized. Okay, but as an example, we have every student with a first name, last name, email address so that we can create their account, and the name of their school, right? This is just a text. And so what the user will do is upload that file, and they'll click on this button to kick off our backend workflow. So I'm going to walk you through the setup that I have here. I've already put it together, so I'm going to take you through it so you can see what everything is doing. When they click on this button, they're first going to run Bubble's upload data as CSV. So this is separate from the backend workflow. This is a standalone action. You can find this under data to upload and create records essentially for every row in your CSV. Okay, now the data type that I have here is a data type called import users. And the fields involved are first name, last name, basically everything we see in the spreadsheet here, email address, and school. Now, there are also fields to relate this import record to an actual user record. So I have a field here, related user. The data type for this is user. And I also have a yes or no field called complete to let me know that this imported user successfully has an actual user account, right? This is going to be helpful for controlling the loop, right? So to make sure that we went through everybody that was imported, we'll take a look at those expressions in a second. But ultimately what I want to do first is take that CSV and create these import user records. The reason I need to do this separately is because Bubble does not let you run this action for the user data type. You cannot upload data directly into the user tables. This is actually a very common piece of functionality that we see with our own clients, is we have a big list of email addresses that we need to create accounts for them in a bulk way. And we have to kind of do this multi-step process, but we did need to make sure that it's going to perform very well. So first we're going to upload every row into a separate data type. Okay, so that's what this import user is for, to just capture all of the details. No relationships necessarily, just the straight text or numbers or dates, whatever might be coming from the CSV, into a record that we can then work from once it's in Bubble. Okay, so the result of this is that all of those import records will be created first. We don't yet have user records. Then we're going to trigger our recursive workflow. Okay, so here we're going to schedule a workflow that I've created in the backend called create user. Now notice that there's a parameter here to reference an individual import record, right? That import user data type that I created. Okay, and from the page, it's going to trigger that backend workflow immediately and pass in the first, notice here, the first import record from our resulting uploaded data. So if I have 10 items, 10 students here, this is going to upload 10 records. We're going to create 10 import users. But when I trigger the backend workflow, it's only going to pass in the first one because I'm starting the loop. Once the loop begins, it's going to handle itself and loop over to run on the second item, then the third item, then the fourth item. It's automated in that way. So I don't need to anticipate how many users. And I especially don't need to worry about a big import coming in if there's thousands of items because Bubble's going to process one at a time. Yes, it may be slower to bring everything in if you have many, many items as opposed to telling Bubble to do things all simultaneously, but it is much more reliable in terms of performance and actually having it complete because Bubble only needs to use as much server resources that are necessary to do one run at a time. It's much, much more performant that way. Okay, it might take a little bit longer compared to a simultaneous importing of multiple records, but it's way more reliable and your app won't crash if you do it this way. So once this has triggered and we have a reference to a single import record, here's the sequence of actions that we would do for this type of feature. The first thing is we want to create a school record. This is a separate data type for every new school name that we see in this list. Okay, so we are saving a list of schools in a separate table, but I only want to see one instance of each school. So we have multiple students at Franklin High School. We have multiple at Wonderland Middle School. There's 2 of them there. We have 2 at the International School of the Arts. So what I really want to see is only 3 school records: Franklin High School, Wonderland, and International School. Right? So the first thing that's going to happen is create a new school if we've never seen this school name before. Right? Only do this if when we search for the schools based on the name, right? This is based off of the import records school field, which is just a text. And if we don't find any, then go ahead and create that new school and save that name to it. Then the next thing we're going to do is create the account for our student. Okay, we're going to run an account action here, and we're going to do schedule, oh, where is it? It is create an account. There it is, create an account for somebody else. So we'll take in the import records email, right? This is now working off of we'll call it the temporary record, right? That we're using to transition the data from the CSV to our actual user records. We're no longer referencing the CSV directly. So the import records email, and then we'll capture all of the details from the import record, first name, last name. We have a field here under the user data type that links the user back to the import record. And this is mostly for documentation to help you troubleshoot if something goes wrong with the import or this backend workflow. You can at least see, hey, does this user have a connection to an import record? Maybe something got missed with the names. We always have a reference back. And because the school would already be created, we're going to relate the user now to the school. So under the user data type, which is this record here, the related school field is now a relationship to the school data type. It's not a text. Now, here we're going to do an independent search for the school. We're searching for schools that match the import records school name. And there should only be one match, so we'll say first item. What we don't want to do here is say, take the result of step 1, because step 1 may not run, right? This might be an import for a student who belongs to a school that already exists in the database, in which case step 1, the condition will not pass. So a new school will not be created. And if we are referring to the result of step 1 and step 1 doesn't happen, then there's going to be an empty value, and then that student doesn't have a relationship to the school. So we want to do an independent search for the school. Okay, so it's not dependent on step 1 actually running. This result could pull the result of the step 1, right? Because by this time the school would exist. Or it would pull the existing school that was created from a previous student. Okay, so an independent search is the safest way to make sure that you find that relationship here. It doesn't matter whether step 1 runs or not. Then in the next step, we're going to update the import record. Again, just more for kind of documentation, making sure that everything is connected and clean and we have a way to refer back to what happened in the relationships. So here I'll say, well, look, as long as step 2 is not empty, we know that there's a user that was created. We'll mark that as complete. We'll say complete is yes. And the import record also has a relationship field back to the user. Again, just to help us know, okay, we know that that record was connected, is the result of step 2 here, that new user record. Now, step 4 is where we set up our loop. Okay, this is going to schedule the create user event to run again. Notice here, my scheduled date, it has no delay. I want this to run immediately as soon as these first 3 actions are done so that it can continue on with my list. Okay, now I only want this to run if I still have import user records where complete is no. As long as there are still users in that import table that have not been connected, then I want this to keep going so that it can create the account for them, right? So if we have at least 1, right, count is greater than 0, then it should keep going. The moment we have no more import records where complete is no, it does not pass the condition, and so the loop stops and we're done. We're done with the full import process. Also notice that I am now manipulating the value of my import record parameter. Remember, from the page, when I first triggered this, I uploaded my file and I triggered the recursive workflow to start. I passed in the first record. So now in the loop, it's going to handle itself to pass in the next record. And what that's going to do is simply search for the very next import user record where complete is no. Remember, the previous run would have changed it to yes. So that one is now knocked out of the list. So this list will simply get smaller and smaller and smaller until we have no more import records where complete is no. But as long as there is, it's simply going to pass the next item where complete is no. And it will just move around itself in a loop. So let's run this so that you can see this in action. I have 2 windows here so that we can see both of our important tables. My user table is what I'm ultimately going after. I want to create a new user record related to a school record for every row that we have in this CSV here. Okay, we'll also see that, you know, if I search for school like this, I don't have, well, this was from a previous test. Let me go ahead and delete this and we'll see them get created again in real time here. Okay, but that's actually what we want to go after, is see those records get created from the backend workflow. Okay, so let's go back to user here for now. And then in my other window, we're also going to keep an eye on the import records. So this to technically be the first thing that gets created, right? Because from the page, this upload data action is what creates these records first. And then the backend workflow will trigger and run itself on a loop. All right, so let's do this. I'm going to preview the page here. And I already have this file saved to my computer. So I'm going to upload this to the file uploader element, like this here, right here. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and click this button. Really nice, because the user just has to do 2 clicks, select the file, create user accounts, and everything else is going to be self-handled. So we see how quickly those records were created just from the upload action. Let me refresh here. And you can see the whole thing is done. We know the whole thing is done, including the backend workflow, because all of these are set to complete equals yes. And we can see that all of these import users have relationships to user records, right? So this was the original text email field. This is a relationship field here to the user. If I open up one of these, right, you can see the related user is actually tied to a user record, which tells us that those users were created properly. If I go to my other table, here are my users. I didn't even have to refresh there. Every user has an email, first name, last name. It's tied back to the related import. It looks like the primary field for the import is the first name field. And it's also tied to the schools properly. This is a relationship field. This is not a text. So if I go back and look at the school table, we can see only 3 records, 1 for each school was created. You can see that the times are basically the same because that recursive workflow was very fast. So obviously in this example, I only had 10 items to run through, but if you have a file with thousands and thousands of items, you can see how helpful this kind of an automated system will be for you. I highly recommend that you set up your database views to help you confirm everything, leverage fields to help you keep track of things as well. The whole purpose of this complete field was to control the loop condition, right? Searching for import users where complete is no. I just have to make sure that when I am finished with an import that I change it to yes, so that it knocks it out of the list of items still to process. Okay, so there you have it. That's a really common example for a recursive workflow. Please know that, I mean, you can get much more complex with this. It's great for working through a big list of items. It's also great for just more of like an infinite static kind of, you know, we're going to do this every single week at the same time or every single day. There's more that you can do within these types of flows, not just sending an email, but you can, you know, check the database for, you know, the email could have a report of the numbers of the last week. So you pull information from your database and supply them in the body of the email. You can create records every single, you know, point that this runs, whether it's daily, weekly, monthly, or hourly, whatever it needs to be. You know, these can trigger API calls using integrations. On a recurring basis where you don't have to babysit it because it's sort of automated in that way. Very, very powerful stuff. So I encourage you to try it out in your own application. Again, remember, you do have to be on a paid plan in order to run these, but the first paid plan is the only requirement there. You don't have to be on any of the higher ones necessarily to test these out. And start with a simple one. You know, start with one where you have a finite recursive workflow. Be mindful that you also have this scheduler under the logs tab to validate and confirm that things have been scheduled. So for example, here, if I go to enable my weekly reminder, remember that was set up for the next Monday at 8 a.m. And if I go back to my scheduler here and show, here it is, October 31st, 8 a.m. That should be a Monday. We'll double check the calendar, but all of that has to do with the manipulation of the date and time there. And this tells me, you know, okay, this was scheduled at the right time. And then once that runs, you'll see, because it will schedule itself to run a week from then, a new log for the next time will show up automatically. You know, the user doesn't have to continue clicking buttons. It's kind of like a self-cleaning thing from that point. If you need to cancel anything, or if you accidentally run an infinite workflow and all of a sudden a bunch of things are getting created in your database, you can pause your backend workflows by clicking on this button here. It's sort of like your kill switch, okay? So if you ever run into that situation, it's almost a rite of passage. We see it happen every once in a while, you know, accidentally triggering a whole bunch of things getting created in your app. Just make sure you go to your logs, scheduler, hit that pause button. Then you can make your correction, you can cancel workflows, you can clear out your database, clean it up, and then just remember to resume so that your backend workflows can run again, okay? Because when you hit pause, everything in your backend workflow will be suspended. They will not be able to run unless you click that button again. All right, everyone, happy building.